Hi everyone, welcome to our spotlight on handwriting. This is our second ever spotlight, which is quite exciting, and we're looking forward to working with you to go through this wonderful topic. Our first spotlight was all on the beanstalk reading approach. If you did miss that, there's a link to it in our think piece, and the recording to this one will also be in our next think piece as well. We are, like I said, we are going to record the session, so if you can leave your cameras on, we're not offended if you want to turn them off, because we're going to use this as a resource moving forward. And I know some people have let us know that they couldn't attend, but they're really keen to catch up on it. Now, in terms of Literacy Excellence Centre, we're here looking at that real expertise around handwriting and solving some of the problems you'll face, and looking at that craft of teaching and how we bring this to life in the classroom. And I know Michelle, when she takes over, will probably feed in some research as well to help you help you keep going with this. Handwriting is becoming quite a hot topic, really, and I guess the whole focus of writing has. And I think it's the writing framework that's brought this front and centre in terms of schools really wanting to engage and to have a fresh look at it. And we knew it was coming. There's been various research bits and pieces out there. Lots of experts have been saying this for quite a while, but I think the two key ones for me were the Strong Foundations research analysis that Ofsted did, and then they did the research review into English back in 2022. And in there was lots of messages that have then been captured into the writing framework, and handwriting being one of them. But what we're really keen to push you to think about is not just the skill itself and all the great stuff that you're about to learn, is this holding some of your children back in terms of their enjoyment and their willingness to be writers? Because what we see often is the handwriting can cause that fluency issue, can cause that overload issue, and so on and so on. And then therefore writing is not a pleasurable experience. So yeah, keep that in mind, as well as all the great guidance. Keep thinking about those children that you work with, and could this be the key ingredient to unlocking them as writers? Now, we in the Literacy Excellence Centre are focused on writing this year with our primary schools, and we've got two other sessions that I hope I can tempt you to come to. The first one is for the early years practitioners, and that's taking place on the 21st of January. That's a morning, it's a half-day session where we're going to really delve into early writing, and looking at what this means for our...
Have you put Michaeli's trainers on the stairs?
I'll just mute you because you will pop up now on the recording. So we've got this early writer session where I'll be taking part in that and sharing some of my expertise, but we'll have an early years leader as well driving that. And maybe something that might interest you if you are a leader or your leader in school is our primary literacy leadership in action session. We're actually going to follow up some of these themes and look at it from a leader point of view in terms of handwriting. We always have a leadership focus. We're going to look at the hot topic of action planning, and it's a great space to keep up to date with local and national opportunities, and then connect with other people that lead English as well. So please do keep that in mind. And really excited, you can try the first one of those for free. And the plan is to eventually charge and make that for members. But actually, you can come and have a taster session of that. If you haven't already, I do hope you consider becoming a Literacy Excellence Centre member. They're the prices. At the moment, we're working on a digital membership as well for those people that might be further afield that can't, access some of the face-to-face events. So look out for that as well. If you do have any questions about it, that's the LEC email, and that's fine as well if you want to get in touch about anything. But what I want to do is hand over to Michelle. Now, I've done a lot of work with schools around writing and reading, and whenever the question comes up about handwriting, I always refer them to the National Handwriting Association. I've done various webinars for National College. I've put their material into my webinars and signpost them, and I've done it for quite a while now. So it's really, really pleasing for me to be able to have the National Handwriting Association here, and particularly Michelle with all her expertise to help guide us through this. So Michelle, we'll just do a quick swap over and make sure we're all good to go.
Great, thank you, Carl. I'll just wait for this to swap over and then I'll start. Just while Carl's taking down his screen, if you are able to have your camera on, that's amazing, but I appreciate not everybody will want to, which is fine. And during my session, so I'll share my screen in just a moment. During my session, please do use the chat function. Please do just unmute if you want to ask anything. This is your training. So if you've got anything pertinent to add or comment on, please do so. If you've got any questions at all, I will do my very best to answer them. So I'll just share my screen now. What will happen is I won't then be able to see everybody, but what I'm going to do is I'm logged in twice. So I've got another camera to model some kind of different grasps, to model some letter families as well by hand. So hopefully this will all go to plan. So I'll just share my screen with you now. Can you all see that's okay? Yep, brilliant, perfect. So now I can see nobody. I can see a couple of little people in the corner. Before we begin, I do have to acknowledge our corporate sponsors at the National Handwriting Association. We are a charity. We are made up of basically a group of therapists, occupational therapists, I should say, and specialist teachers. And we all work in our normal day-to-day jobs, and then we come together to work for the National Handwriting Association, always promoting the most up-to-date evidence about handwriting, and everything we do is very ingrained with what our general day-to-day practice is. But yes, as I say, we are a charity. You can check us out on our website, which I'll just go to now, which is there. And feel free to follow us on LinkedIn or on Instagram. If you do have any questions following the training, please do get in touch. We also run much more in-depth training, which I should mention now. So we run a 3-day course every term, and we run monthly twilights on a Monday night, normally 7 till 8 p.m. I know my colleague Amanda McLeod has just done one for left-handers. So they're all sort of just different topics. And I think they're £15 to attend. So they're really inexpensive if you're wanting some specific training. Okay, so I'm going to quickly introduce myself as well, if that's okay, just to give you some context as to who I am and where I'm coming from and what my background is. So my name is Michelle Stone, as I said. I'm first and foremost a teacher. I have worked teaching primary schools, predominantly in early years and Key Stage 1. And about 10 years ago, I began to specialise in physical support in mainstream schools. So that's where my interest in handwriting really began, specifically. And I attended the NHA 6-day course about 8 years ago. And it was just absolutely fascinating. And it was something I wished I'd had when I started teaching. It would have been so useful. And, you know, when you think back and think, oh, if I'd have known this, it would have been really helpful. So that's my role. Throughout this session today, I'm going to be talking with you about, we will go into a brief history of handwriting, why it still remains important. We'll talk about where are we kind of up to in terms of handwriting within our school system, because as Carl mentioned, it's really been brought to the fore with the writing framework being released and also the recent curriculum review. So at the NHA, we've always thought it was very important, and there wasn't really any, certainly not enough training on it nationally. And we know there's been a huge push in phonics in the last 20, 25 years, but there's been pretty much nothing in terms of national guidance for handwriting. So I'll also talk you through how we can hopefully raise the profile of handwriting. And then the final kind of section of the twilight today is going to be around how to actually teach handwriting. So what do we want our handwriting teaching to look like? And hopefully that's enough information for this evening. Okay, let me just move on. Okay. So what I really want you to leave this evening's session with is a greater understanding of handwriting and how it fits within our system. We do know that in pretty much every single school, the majority of children are handwriting as their main means of recording. So unless they have a specific reason for using an alternative means of recording, handwriting is their primary means of getting down their information. And so it stands to reason that we need to make sure handwriting is taught well and taught effectively. And yeah, we'll go through that this evening. I am talking a little bit about the history of handwriting, as I said, because it does explain a little bit about how we're doing things now and how we kind of got to this point. And then, as I say, we'll go through having a really solid understanding of how best to teach handwriting. Before I kind of get into detail, Are you, if you're able to, just to raise your hand on the screen so you can press the button to raise your hand, if you've ever had any handwriting training, specifically handwriting training before, just to help me get a bit more of an idea. So if you can just put your hand up, yes or no. If I don't see any hands going up, I'll assume no. Has anybody ever had any handwriting training before? Oh, Kim, lovely, thank you, Kim. Penguins at Greenwood, thank you. Okay, we've got a couple, lovely. Okay, brilliant. All right, fantastic. And obviously, I know you're all from different schools and different settings. So this is a general training. If you did ever want anything more specific, please do ask because we can provide more in-depth training. In terms of handwriting training specifically, some people may have received it through a scheme if their school has bought into that scheme, and others maybe have attended an HA training or a different type of training. Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. All right, I'm just going to pop that one down. Lovely. Like I said, please do use the chat function throughout. Really, really helpful just to kind of have feedback as we're going along. Right, so kind of to begin with, I want to think about having a really shared understanding of handwriting. So if I can ask you to write in the chat just a couple of brief highlights of what your understanding is of handwriting. You might want to put also how you're currently teaching it. I'd like you to also think about whether or not your school has a handwriting policy, and just pop those notes in the chat function. So just a brief understanding of handwriting from you. How are you currently teaching handwriting, and do you have a handwriting policy? Lovely, thank you. So I've got Andy, Harriet and Sarah have talked about having good posture, formation presumably of letters and size. Lovely, thank you. Great, thank you, Kim. So pencil grip, letter formation, consistency, absolutely, I would agree with all of those. Okay, and I've heard a few things about the little Wandle handwriting. Lovely, thank you. Interesting. Okay, letter join, yep. So handwriting policy in school from Hannah and uses letter join. Pen pals for letter formation, and little Wandle is it little Wandle handwriting used in foundation stage? I think. H boy has put 10 minutes per day, 20 minutes on day 4, using letter. Oh, there's quite a few of you using letter join. Lots of little Wandle, pencil grip posture, core strength, letter formation joins, daily practice. Lauren has put Martin Harvey. There's a few schools near me who use Martin Harvey actually. Fine motor, yeah, absolutely need to be developed hand in hand with transcriptional fluency. So Martin Harvey has shown your school and now using fonts that link to letter join. Lovely, this is great, thank you. Rachel's using squiggle while you wiggle, and then pen pals, lots of focus on strength, core, shoulder, etc., especially in the early years, absolutely. Okay, lovely, thank you so much. If you did comment, that's really, really helpful. I've also got a comment about posture, position, grip control, transcription, letter formation. Yeah, absolutely. Good handwriting can help with writing fluency and reducing cognitive overload. Completely agree. Perfect. Thank you so much. It's really, really helpful just to get that kind of basic understanding as to where we are currently working at, because there are, it's not like phonics where we have all the validated schemes. What we have is lots of commercially available schemes, but not all of them necessarily fit with what we would like to promote in terms of the best way to teach handwriting. So it's always interesting to hear about what people are using. I love that there's so many mentions of the motor skills needed for handwriting, and also talking about the posture needed, the grip, positioning of letters, etc. So that's really helpful. Thank you. In terms of your own handwriting, what I'd like you to do just very quickly is write this sentence in your own handwriting, and there is a point to this. So could you please write the sentence, "The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog"? And I'll pop it into the chat in case anyone forgets. So, quick. So I've just popped it into the chat so you can be reminded. I'm sure you've all seen that sentence before. Okay. Once you've done that, I would like you, please, if you can, to just pop into the chat anything you noticed about your own writing. So your grip, how you're holding your pen or pencil, how do you form your letters, anything at all that you've noticed, just to kind of set the scene for what we're doing this evening. Okay, interesting. So someone's put, you don't always join, there's room for improvement. We've got a painful hand. Carl said he's rusty as he mainly types. Becky sometimes has to think about the joins. Yep. Okay. If there's any more, I'll comment on them. But thank you. Not your normal writing. Your normal has been joined. Your grip's not correct. That's interesting. And we'll have a think about what is a correct or effective grasp. Your own joins aren't the same as the ones that you teach. And Kim's tried to be really neat. Well done, Kim. Great. Sometimes don't join the T if it's followed by an H. Interesting. Okay. Okay, Kate feels it's soothing when it flows. That's interesting. Handwriting can feel quite therapeutic, can't it, at times? Okay, letter sizes are always right. Good. Lovely. Thank you for doing that. So I'd just like to do that with you all to really set the scene, because quite often we can really take handwriting for granted because obviously we're educated adults and we're teaching handwriting. But actually there's so much more going on. It's interesting, a couple of you have mentioned about grasp, and I will go through an effective grasp. Yeah, I can see some more things coming through. So someone, Giovanna said, a bit of a scrawly writer, joining some letters, but models it better when writing for the children. And I think we all do that, but I think the kind of key point here really is that handwriting is very, very important. How we write as practitioners is key. And also the fact that it's all very individual. So we're not all doing exactly the same thing, even though we are discussing handwriting teaching tonight. So thank you for doing that. Okay, I'm going to move forward. So in terms of, do we still need to teach handwriting? I'm hoping we would all agree that we do. We know that how we teach handwriting often has a really big impact. We teach handwriting. Sometimes it's had a huge impact depending on how we've been taught to handwrite ourselves, or the kind of exposure we've had to handwriting. So if you think kind of historically, you would have had, depending on how old you are and where you went to school, if we bear in mind that the national curriculum wasn't introduced until 1989, I certainly started school before then, so I would have been taught just however my teacher saw fit. And it's a really tricky skill to kind of unlearn. So I do want you to just have a think about how you were taught, and then does that have any bearing on how you're currently teaching it? Okay. Every school has a slightly different approach to teaching handwriting. We could argue that actually it would be much more useful to have a more consistent approach across, English schools. But at the moment we are kind of where we are with it. So it's up to us to take the information from the curriculum review, and from the writing framework, and really look at what we know in terms of evidence behind handwriting, and then bringing that all together as in deciding on a sound pedagogy as to how we teach handwriting. Okay. So in terms of going really back to basics, what is handwriting? So handwriting is any writing done with a hand using a pencil, pen, or digital stylus. So if we just think about handwriting is essentially a mode of expressing and communicating language, that's what we ultimately want to achieve. The writing framework that was released in July of this year shared the simple view of writing model. So you can see on your screen or you might have the slides as well, actually. If you see the rectangle on the right-hand side, this is the simplified version that the people who wrote the framework have used. And it's actually based on the original simple view of writing by Beringer, which you can see on the left. essentially what it's saying is that in order to be a competent writer, we need to have a good level of language composition as well as good transcription skills. So it sounds really obvious, it's not rocket science, is it, that in order for children or anybody to be a competent writer, they need to have a sufficient level of language and communication skills. And they also need, kind of married to that, they need to have good transcription skills. It's very difficult to be a competent writer without both those elements. Oh, interesting. Thank you. So Andy, Harriet and Sarah have just said we recently did this in a previous staff meeting. Really eye-opening and helpful. Yeah, absolutely. So it's really interesting, isn't it? It sounds really obvious when you look at it in black and white, but it's not something we've maybe thought about enough. As I'm going through, hopefully what you will see, and I'm sure you already are aware of, is what a complex task handwriting actually is. So it's really important we understand kind of how to begin it effectively. Okay. So if we think about handwriting, sorry, my laptop is flicking. If we think about handwriting versus mark making, if we're thinking kind of from a child development point of view, children, babies, infants are born very much with an inherent natural mark making skill. So they want to make marks. You might make a mark in the sand. You might have a toddler who's tipped a load of food on a high chair and they're making marks. They might have a paintbrush and they're just squiggling around. It's up to us then as practitioners to really harness this natural skill and teach handwriting from that. Okay, so once children are ready, and we'll talk about readiness for writing a little bit, it's time to kind of begin teaching handwriting. It is really important to mention at this point, and I will go through a little bit about the curriculum expectations. There's a slight mismatch between what we're looking for in the early learning goals and then what's expected by the end of year one in terms of handwriting. So in the early learning goals, you'll be aware that it says writing simple phrases that can be read by themselves and others. And it also talks about using the tripod grasp in almost all cases. That's in the EYFS. That's actually the only mention of grasp in the curriculum. So other than that, in the national curriculum for Key Stages 1 and 2, it talks about using an effective grasp. So we can come on to kind of dissecting that a little bit more, because sometimes we can get a bit hung up on this in early years, and we could argue we maybe don't need to. Okay. Can I ask you at this point, just to pop into the chat, how would you know when children are ready for handwriting? So what would tell you? So, we're going to come on to this in more detail, but just kind of at the moment, what would you deem as being ready for writing? Yeah, thank you. So having sufficient gross and fine motor skills, absolutely. Yeah, showing an interest absolutely in mark making. And that comes back to that motivation, doesn't it, as well? And it talks about that in the framework. Yeah, absolutely. Being able to hold a pencil or mark making implement with control. Yeah, interesting. So can identify graphemes and recall these. Thank you, Rachel. So good core strength for holding themselves up. And yeah, I've obviously been at work today working with a pupil this morning whose core strength was very weak, and he was almost falling off the chair by the time we'd done our assessment. So his writing, was problematic. Okay. Yep. So can maybe trace copy lines or letters. A good development of fine motor skills, holding a pencil. Yeah, communicating through marks, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Okay, great. Yeah, absolutely. So I would agree with all of those things. And I was just chatting with Carl and Elaine before we began, and it can be very tricky to kind of know exactly when children are ready for writing, and it would come back to what you have decided as a school or as a setting as to when you begin and how you begin. I would always take it back to having a sufficient handwriting policy so that you've got some way of, whether it's just practitioners assessing, but how do you know when to begin? And that's something we haven't always thought about. We do think about it a lot with phonics, and we teach certain sounds on certain days, but we haven't always got the same with handwriting. Okay, lovely, thank you for that. So, difficulties with handwriting. I've included this slide, and I have used this before. This is a pupil I've worked with, a real pupil, a Key Stage 2 boy. And I like to include this because it just highlights some of the difficulties we see often in handwriting. Sorry. This particular pupil, there's lots of difficulties within the handwriting. I mean, I don't know what you're seeing in your settings. Do you see handwriting difficulties, or are kind of things running quite smoothly? I don't know if anyone wants to unmute and mention what they see, or whether we just pop it in the chat. Okay, that's fine. I mean, I see this a lot. I see writing like this a lot, and it's really tricky. It's very, very tricky to kind of go back to starting at the beginning. This particular pupil has, and I've known this pupil some time, been taught to join too soon was one of the main difficulties. And also this pupil has been taught with the lead-in stroke, which we know is not recommended. It is possible to support and put interventions in place, but obviously, like with any motor skill, particularly in handwriting is a motor skill, but also cognitive, it can be really, really difficult to go back and unpick handwriting difficulties. It can be done. It just needs a lot of intervention and a lot of support. Thank you. Yeah, Bex and Holly have just put older children are often set in their ways of writing. Absolutely. The pupil I worked with just this morning, writing was quite similar to this. And it's tricky because I certainly feel that if he had been taught differently, things could have looked different. And it's not to place any shame or anything on how we are teaching, because we're all just trying to do our best, aren't we, with education. But we do know if we can get handwriting right from the beginning, it's just so much easier for everybody, and we can avoid kind of problematic handwriting like this. Okay. So what do we actually need in order to be successful handwriters? Please feel free to pop in the chat. I'm just going to kind of start talking through it because we've already mentioned some of these things throughout the course of the training so far. So we know that we need a certain level of cognition. That's absolutely vital. We need to be able to hear instructions. We need to be able to see, so thinking about visual processing. So the way, if you think about those visual perception kind of images where you've got like a vase or two faces, things like that, where can children discriminate between what they're seeing on the page? They need to have a really good level of visual skills in order to be able to be a successful handwriter. They need a sufficient neck, shoulder, arm strength, stability. A couple of you have touched on this already. They need to have a really good level of fine motor strength, as well as decent posture and balance to maintain that sitting position for writing. So you can see here, these are the things that we're looking for. We do know as well that handwriting actually, although it is a motor skill, predominantly it's a cognitive skill. So the motor skill element is almost kind of the last bit, if you like, but because first of all, we need to be able to construct a sentence, hold in mind what we want to write. We need to have all the motor skills elements in place, and then we will write, or then we'll hopefully be able to write. So there's lots of things that need to happen before we can be ready for writing. Okay. So in terms of developing motor skills, we know that this is still a priority, particularly in the early years. Nationally and possibly worldwide, we're seeing, I think the statistic is today's generation are doing something like 60% less physical outdoor exercise than the generation of like the 1980s and 90s children. So if you think about that, if you think that we know in order for children to reach a good level of physical development by age 5, the recommendation from the NHS is that children have a minimum of 3 hours physical activity and outdoor play every day to develop the necessary motor skills. So if we're kind of thinking about that, there's a massive gap there, isn't there? I don't know whether you're seeing this. I'm certainly seeing in my day-to-day work, just generally, motor skills seem to be weaker. We could talk about the reasons for that, but I think it's just important to bear in mind that, you know, the beginning of any sort of typical development in children is around those gross motor skills, and then the fine motor skills should develop with practice after that. Okay. Some quick examples. If we have early years teachers on the call, I apologise because this will be really obvious to you and it may be obvious to the rest of you as well, but just showing some examples really. So you can see the children in the top left with the sweeping brushes. All they've got is like washing up liquid and a brush. But actually in terms of pre-handwriting skills, they're developing grasp, they're developing an understanding of pressure, they're developing an understanding of their marks, you know, on the playground. Same with the pupil with the tuff tray, so going round and round, again developing the strength in terms of the fine motor skills and just making a mark really as well. Understanding positional and directional language too is really, really useful when we're developing those skills in the early years. The pupil climbing on the tyres, so great for developing that cross crawl motion, which will really support the postural strength, so that ability to maintain a sitting posture. Okay. The ways to support, and I'm just touching on this briefly because you could go into lots more detail, but if we need to support these things, if it's not coming as naturally as we would like, what we want to do is make sure we've got plentiful provision in place so that children are able to develop their gross and fine motor skills sufficiently to go on to become effective writers. We also talk about ergonomic factors. So hopefully you're familiar with the term ergonomics. So the science of fitting the environment around us rather than us having to fit the environment. So an example of that might be when you've got your children who are going up to year 3. So they've gone from year 2 to year 3. And all of a sudden they're on really high tables and high chairs. And they've got, more petite children, their feet are kind of dangling. So they haven't got that decent postural control when they're writing because of the furniture. So it's quite a straightforward thing, but it's just something to consider. And I know it's not always easy, depends what you've got in your setting, but it is something to consider and think about. Okay, so moving on to fine motor strength. What I want to do at this point is just model some effective grasps. I'm just going to attempt to switch my camera. We know in order to model an in order to develop an effective grasp, children need that flexibility and stability and strength in the wrist, hands and fingers, and they need to start to develop the separation of their hands. So in relation to handwriting, the ring finger and the little finger are really just there for support. Most of the movement when you're holding a pen or pencil needs to come from the thumb, the index finger and the tall finger as well. Okay, so I'm just going to switch my camera hopefully and show you some grasps. So let me just double check I know what I'm doing here. So I think that should work. Can you see my hand? Lovely. And then if I do the spotlight, that's worked. Okay, lovely. Can you see my hand? Is that the main thing that you can see? Brilliant. Okay, so I'm just going to share with you. So this is a really nice way to start to develop a decent grasp if you've got early years. There's lots of different effective functional grasps. The main one that we talk about a lot, oh, you can't all see it? Or you should be able to. So if you go to, might be your view. So if you can go to view, you should be able to see it. I've spotlighted it. Can everyone else see it? Just double checking.
Yeah, I can see it, Michelle. It's spotlighted for me because swap your camera.
Okay, so it should be the main thing you can see, hopefully. Bex and Holly, can you see it now?
Yeah, if it's that little camera that you can see in terms of the paper and the pencil, you can change the size of it on your screen. So if you click on the bottom right, you can drag it open a little bit more, so you can see Michelle's pen a little bit bigger. Obviously, she's still got her slide. So, Michelle, I wonder if it's worth stopping the presentation just so then it'll go full screen for everybody. That might help. That's
okay.
yeah.
Is
That's
that
great.
better?
Yeah, so hopefully that should help those people that were struggling.
Brilliant, thank you.
There we go. They can see now.
You can see that. Perfect, lovely. So in terms of kind of that development of grasp, what we know is that typically children will start off with much of a palmar grasp. They'll then move on to having more of what we call a digital pronate. And what we want to do, as I say, the only mention of the tripod grasp is in the EYFS. A really nice way to promote that is just have your thumb and index finger and just grab and pop back into your web space. So that's what you're looking for. You've got that separation of the hands here. So the fingers that are doing the work are my index finger, my tall finger, and my thumb. And the little finger and the ring finger are really just there for support. Okay. There are other effective grasps. So you might have a pupil, I'll show you the different crayon. So you might have a pupil, for example, who is holding it with an alternate tripod, which is like this. Hopefully you can see that. It's still a tripod, but it's just an alternative. Okay. You might also have pupils who are more of a quadrupod. Let's see if that's right. Yeah, more like this. So they've got all 3 fingers on the pencil. The reason the kind of this dynamic tripod that I'm showing you now is ideal is because it gives the most movement. So if I was to write the word dog, you can see that the only things that are moving are my thumb and my 2 fingers. Everything else, my shoulder, my wrist, is still. Okay. Whereas if I'm writing, I've worked with children a lot who write like this. So I mean, it's so difficult to hold the pen and not be in pain. I mean, that's just so difficult, and that is going to cause problems usually in terms of legibility. Other kind of effective grasps would be really anything that's not impeding speed, legibility, and not causing pain. But the ultimate kind of ideal grasp is a dynamic tripod, just for the reasons I've suggested, but it really isn't the be all and the end all. It obviously depends on the age of your pupil. It depends on whether they've got additional needs. I've got a pupil I was working with today. He's year 5, has a problematic grasp, but for me to change that now would be really, really tricky. And he's got other things going on as well. So my general assessment on balance, I don't think I would attempt to do that. Some people may argue that we should attempt to change grasps, but it's really on an individual basis. You can get really nice, like that's just a nice pen, where it's got the little smiley face when you're holding it with that dynamic tripod. You can see it's really comfortable, this one. And it's very difficult to hold it any other way because of where the grooves are. So hopefully you can see that okay. Right. I would also just mention at this point, having choice in terms of what children write with. I don't know whether you have a specific pencil or pen or what your children are writing with. This one is a Stabilo Easy Graph. It comes in a thicker and finer lead. It's really comfortable. It's got little grooves. They come in right and left-handed. This one's also a really nice one. This is a bit old. It's a Faber-Castell one. You know, it really does depend on what your pupils find comfortable as to what you're writing with. Okay, let me just flip back. So I unspotlight. I turn that off. And then so I think I need to go here. Apologies, just bear with me a second. And then go there. Does that work? Can you see my slides again?
Yes, these slides are back up now.
Fantastic. Oh, it's going well. Great. Okay, so that was a very whistle-stop tour about grasp, but it is important just to remember what we're looking for is really a functional grasp and something that's going to be effective for your pupil.
Michelle, are you still using your close-up camera, or are you swapping back to you?
No, let me turn that off.
Yeah.
Is that better?
Yeah, it's still spotlighted. Obviously, you want your one back now, don't we? I might be able to do it.
Has that worked?
Right, I've spotlighted you now, so you're back on. You're back on. There we go. We can see you.
Okay, lovely. All right, brilliant. Okay, so we'll carry on. I just want to quickly mention technology. We know that there's obviously a boom in technology and everybody is using screens a lot more than we ever before. It can seem, and probably is the case, that generally children are seeing a lot less handwriting. I think sometimes that can mean that in the home, children just and maybe not valuing it as much. You know, I'm not sure how it's valued so much by many adults anymore. But certainly in education, it is something we need, and we know that there was an article by Simon Horbury about the positive effects of note-taking on memory recall. So we do know there is strong evidence to show that note-taking by hand actually is really, really good for our memory recall and being able to just generally remember information that we've been shown. However, if you have a pupil with an additional need or for whatever reason is going to be physically unable to handwrite, you know, certainly you'd want to have something in your policy about what type of technology is going to be useful and how it will be used. So whether that's typing or scribing or maybe a voice, some kind of voice to text software. It is important to consider it, but for the most part, for the majority of children, we would be expecting handwriting to be taught sufficiently. Okay, so at this point, I'd like you to just consider, how do we view handwriting in schools? So are we thinking it's an art form? Is it beautiful calligraphy? Or is it a functional tool? And if you could please pop your comments in the chat, that would be great. No? We've got one? Okay, lovely. Yeah, lots of emphasis on beautiful writing, a bit of both. Yeah, lovely. Yeah, absolutely agree. Yeah, so Andy Harrington and Sarah have just said it's a functional tool, but when we put too many expectations on children, for example, joining in a certain way, it can become more of an art form. Yeah, Cassie said it depends what the writing is for. Absolutely. Yeah, so it can be both, can't it, depending on the purpose. So functional to begin with and then potentially progresses into an art form. Yeah, note-taking is functional. And then once the hard work is done, the cognitive load is reduced and it can be beautiful. Okay, lovely. Thank you for those comments. I do like to just ask that question because I think it's something we need to keep in mind. Over the years, certainly in my own teaching, there's been lots of emotive language used around handwriting. So someone's already mentioned beautiful handwriting. And when I go into the history of handwriting, you'll kind of see where that's come from. We need to remember that we are wanting functional handwriting. We do want it to be presentable, absolutely. We're not teaching calligraphy, we're teaching handwriting. So the main aim of handwriting is it's functional, it's legible for both the reader and the writer, and it's effective. So obviously we want the presentation to be of a decent standard, but that doesn't need to come at the expense of, maybe putting children off writing. Okay, so just keep that in mind. All right, so we are just going to have a brief history of handwriting, just to kind of set the scene as to why we do things how we do. Okay, so over the years, handwriting has changed massively, the purpose and how we write it. So early kind of systems of writing, if you think about hieroglyphics or Chinese scripts, would have been kind of an original way of mark making or writing. Handwriting would have often been copying texts from religious documents. It was very much a scholarly practice. So it wasn't something that everybody was doing. Fast forward a bit. In the kind of 17th and 18th centuries, we started to use metal nibs, and this allowed for that fine copper plate script, and you can see an example on your screen. Interestingly, the original reason for that use of the lead-in stroke was to begin the flow of the ink. There's no other reason for the lead-in stroke, it's just a style. And handwriting really was essential now for trade, correspondence and education. Whizzing forward again, so into the 20th century from the industrial age, mass literacy absolutely expanded, and handwriting needed to be taught across the board. Bringing up to the sort of 1950s and 60s, there's an example here on the right-hand side of the screen. This is taken from, it was essentially a scheme from Marion Richardson, and this was focused on lots of patterning, and it was very flowy, so lots of joining and kind of loopy letters. In the late 20th century, there was a huge focus on legibility, fluency and efficiency, and there was a massive debate around printing and cursive and what does that actually mean. Bringing us up now, so contemporary handwriting, what we now know that we need to do is really balance handwriting with digital skills, but we still know that handwriting remains absolutely vital for communication and fine motor development. In terms of what style of handwriting, I know some of you have said about the different schemes that you're using. So we've had mention of Little Wandle, Letter Join, Pen Pals. The example here is actually from Pen Pals. What I'd like you to just think about is what style font are you using to teach handwriting? Do you know? You might not know, but if you do, what style font are you using to teach handwriting? And if you could pop it in the chat, that would be really super. So Letter Join, does it have a specific font is more the question. So you're using the scheme Letter Join, but what is the font within it? So is it just Letter Join font? Okay. Yep. So we've got using the one recommended by Letter Join without the lead-ins. Rachel thinks Sassoon Primary joined. Okay, interesting. So that kind of moves us on really nicely to some of the terminology around handwriting. I do want to mention the word cursive. Do any of you use the word cursive when you're teaching handwriting? You can give me a thumbs up or just pop in the chat.
You've never been that indecisive.
Was that about cursive? I didn't quite catch it.
Sorry?
I was just saying, does anybody use the word cursive when they're teaching handwriting?
Lower.
Okay.
Come off mute, Michelle.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Don't worry. So I'll just talk around it. So the original literal meaning of the word cursive is taken from the Latin verb, which essentially means to flow. And what we've done over the last 25 years or so is we, as in educationalists, have taken the word cursive, put it with continuous, and created what we generally take to mean as a method of writing. So where every single letter is joined. There is actually no sort of official definition for that. And I do think it's important that we are aware of the language we're using when we're teaching handwriting. Just like you do in phonics, where you're talking about phonemes and graphemes, etc., we need to be really clear on the language we're using when we're teaching handwriting. Because the general definition of continuous cursive is that every single letter is starting on the line, from the line, i.e. the lead-in, and then every single letter joins. And that's actually not what we want to be doing. Okay. There was I can't remember the name of the I think it was called a P hacking scandal, where there was kind of falsely released evidence that the continuous cursive stroke supported dyslexic learners, but we actually know that that's not the case. There is no evidence to support that. And so we would always advocate teaching letters in the simplest, most dynamic form with an exit flick where it makes sense to do so, and then it gives the potential to join. Okay. I've just borrowed this from Morell's handwriting because I think it's a really useful slide. I've again been in a couple of schools today for work, and the bottom sentence is what I have seen, even though we know we're not meant to be using the lead-in stroke, and we know that the curriculum says all resources designed for children to be read by children should be in print. So the bottom sentence is neither. So it is just important to get our heads around that if we haven't already. Okay. I just wanted to draw attention to useful statutory assessments, really just to highlight that there's essentially what we do in schools is we use handwriting as the vehicle for producing this work that's then assessed, but we don't actually assess handwriting specifically. So in the RBA, so the reception baseline assessment, we're looking at communication, reading, and basic math skills. There's no actual mention of handwriting unless you decide to put it in, and look at something as a practitioner. We've then essentially got the same phonics screening. So we're looking at phonics, but we haven't got any specific assessment for handwriting. For year 6 SATs, what we know is that we want a predominantly joined style, but that doesn't mean joining every single letter in order to meet the expected standard. So even for that greater depth standard, we don't need to join every single letter. And it is really clear in the curriculum where it talks about knowing which letters are best left unjoined. And then we go on, we've got the proposed year 8 assessments, end of year 9, and then GCSEs. So although pretty much all these assessments are handwritten, we don't ever really assess handwriting, if that makes sense. It can be really useful as a setting to think about how you might want to assess handwriting. So you might want to look at, in your early years, potentially looking at something in foundation stage where, lots of you have mentioned it in the chat already. Do children have the sufficient motor skills and fine motor development to be able to hold a pencil? Do they have an understanding of what marks mean? Can they form a line or a circle? That could be your assessment. As you're going up through Key Stage 1, you might use a simple pangram. So we used the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog. You can just Google pangrams. So they're just sentences that use every letter of the alphabet. And you could choose one, you could pick one, and use it as a bit of an assessment for writing, for handwriting. The biggest thing we know from the research is that the best way to assess handwriting is to have eyes on. I know that can be really difficult when you've got a large class if you're a teacher on your own, but if you can make time somewhere in your day to have eyes on how are children forming the letters, is this the correct orientation? Are they able to place them on the lines, etc.? It can be really useful to support with either next steps or intervention as needed. Okay. So, ensuring readiness for writing, how would we do this as practitioners? And I'd like you to have a think about this, and please do pop it in the chat or unmute if you're comfortable to. That's absolutely fine. So, how can we as practitioners ensure readiness for writing? Hoping you're all just thinking about it. Yeah, thanks, Carl. So a clear progression so we know what the markers are and how well our children are doing. Yep. Okay, well, maybe just talk around it a little bit as well. Yeah, pencil grip, thanks, Bex and Holly. Okay, I mean, in terms of readiness for writing, what we'd be really looking for is if you think back to all the different skills we talked about at the beginning, and I know it's quite a whistle-stop tour, but we talked about predominantly having the necessary communication and language skills to really develop their knowledge of sentence structure. And that's all mentioned again in the writing framework, the kind of knowledge of sentence level understanding. Alongside the motor skills, and then hopefully we've got readiness for writing. Absolutely, thank you. Someone else has put about pencil grip, pincer formation, planned opportunities for motor play in the early years. Absolutely. Lots of opportunities for children to develop and strengthen gross and fine motor. Lots of opportunities for writing. Absolutely. And emergent writing. Absolutely. Yeah, lovely. So you know, within your provision, you'd want to have different mark making areas or a writing area, or different kind of experiences for the children, perhaps in the role play where they can write and have practitioners modeling that in the early years. That's ideally what we'd be looking for. It's then very much up to you as a school about when and how you begin. And I'm going to start talking through that very soon. But it is important to have an understanding of which letters you are teaching and in which order. And we know from the writing framework that teaching handwriting and phonics does need to be separate. Not saying there's an easy way to do this, but I am saying it's something we do need to do. And this is something the NHA has always advocated. We've always talked about how handwriting does need to be separate. Obviously, there's massive links, but also they are completely different skills. So it's really important that we're clear in our minds as to what that would look like. Okay. So just to we're going to start on the final section in a minute. What I'd like you to think about is just really our aims at the end of primary school. So this is what we are looking for by the end. So we want our students to have legible, fluent, fast enough writing. It needs to be comfortable. And above all else, it needs to be automatic. If we can get children to have automatic writing, we're halfway there. If we've got children who go into year 7 unable to write legibly and at length, they're going to really struggle with their GCSEs. I see this all the time. The curriculum ramps up every key stage, doesn't it? There's so much content that we have to get through. But the number of children coming into year 7 unable to write legibly is quite concerning, really. So it is up to us, hopefully, to get it right from the beginning. No pressure. Okay. So I'm going to move on to P-checks and grasp, and we've touched on this briefly. The P-checks essentially are how we know that we're ready for writing. I'm so sorry, my laptop is flipping and I'm not sure why. So when we're thinking about readiness for writing, we can maybe use the P checks to kind of determine that readiness. And it links really nicely to all the comments everybody's made. So we'd want to make sure that posture is effective. We'd want to make sure pencil grip is okay. We'd want to make sure children have got a good understanding of where to position their paper and a good understanding of pressure, so the pressure with which to apply. Really simply, we can think of posture as 90-90-90. So, I mean, I'm aware that if you're in an early years classroom right now, you're going to be sat on a tiny chair and you will not have very good posture. But ideally, what we're looking for is our hips, knees, and ankles to be at 90 degrees. So just, 90-90-90. We'd always want feet flat on the floor. It's really difficult to maintain that posture if you're kind of hanging off the chair or you haven't got your feet flat on the floor. Roughly, you'd want your tummy a fist distance from the table, and we would always advocate using your non-dominant hand to stabilise the paper. Okay, all good. So ways that we can support to improve posture. That brings me back to ergonomics, so where I mentioned about looking at the environment. If you're in the early years, more often than not, you don't have 30 chairs and table space. So it's really about making sure it's suited for if you're doing it in a small group, that you've got the necessary furniture and right height tables and chairs for your children. Again, it might seem like really common sense, but always checking that children can see what's being shown. So think about where they're positioned. Think about the angle that you're sat at. So if you are a right-handed teacher like me, I'd want to make sure I'm avoiding not covering up the writing. And if you're a left-hander, again, you need to think about your positioning. Okay. That does bring me a little bit, I'm not going to go into detail on left-handers, but it does bring me to mention them here. In terms of when we've got an established hand dominance, some children won't have an established hand dominance until around age 7. Most children are much sooner. Most children, generally by the end of the early years, you would see whether they're right or left-handed. The curriculum does talk about how we're modelling specifically for left-handers. And what that means is ideally, even if you're right-handed, if you are able to model with your left hand effectively, then it's a great idea to do that, because what we tend to see is that left-handed children don't see themselves being kind of reflected unless you happen to be a left-handed teacher. Because when you're left-handed, you tend to push the letters, whereas right-handers are pulling, because in English we write left to right. And just check where they're positioned as well. So if you have a right and a left-hander together next to each other at the table, your left-hander generally will need a bit more space. And that's often because they hold the pen or pencil slightly further up to be able to see what they're writing. We would never want a hook grasp from a left-hander. We would always want the same as for a right-hander, where you've got the wrist below the writing. We're all good so far. So we've talked a little bit about grasp. At the end, if I make sure we've got time for questions and discussion, if you've got any specific grasp questions, please do ask. But hopefully I've modelled enough for now. The kind of golden rule is always, if there's pain or fatigue, or if it's really illegible, then you would look at changing the grasp. But if it's effective, comfortable, you need to think about whether or not it's worth attempting to change it. Obviously, it depends on the individual pupil as well. Okay, and I've shown you some of these, but I just wanted to share on the screen as well. So you can see along the top line some effective grasp. We've got the tripod grip for a left-hander here and for a right-hander here. This one is the quadrupod, because you can see that long finger is brought round to add additional stability. It's not necessary, but if you've got a pupil that does that quite comfortably, it wouldn't be something you would need to correct. And then this is the alternative tripod here that you can see as well. At the bottom, so the bottom row, these are what we'd call ineffective grasps or problematic grasps that we would attempt to change. And the reason for this is because generally they will cause a lot of pain. They'll be really hard to sustain over time as well. I'm mindful when I'm saying that I work with children, some of whom have additional needs, and particularly if they're maybe older, I don't want to put them off by saying we need to change your grasp. So it's just a real balancing act. Obviously, you need to know who your pupil is. Will they tolerate something different? You could try different pencil grips. I personally prefer ergonomic pens and pencils. I find them much easier, and generally children won't eat them, whereas grips can be eaten, can't they? They can in my experience. Okay. So what I'd like to do now is I'd really love it if you could share what you currently do in your setting to not only support early handwriting, but also how you're maybe doing it further up the school. So we had some mention of this earlier, but if you could just share specific examples as to exactly what you're doing in a typical kind of handwriting session, that would be really good. Okay, thank you very much. So we've got Bex and Holly 3 times a week in English, modelling a progressive scheme. Okay, Dan G is using visualizers to model handwriting. Okay, Lauren is modelling how to form each letter and each join. Lovely. Reese, consistent practice with live feedback. Nice. Andy, Harriet and Sarah, so they've got a warm-up, teaching the letter or join, children having a go, reflecting on formation. Lovely. R. Carlin, daily handwriting sessions. Nice. Lauren's using mnemonics to help with understanding where to start and finish letters. Lovely. Okay, great. And then we've got Hannah reminding children about their posture. Nice. Using a handwriting repeater. Is that on the interactive whiteboard where it keeps going? Is that what? Yeah. Children writing a full sentence, peer or self-assess. Okay, against your waggle. Okay, nice. Lovely, thank you very much. That's really helpful. It just helps me to know kind of what's going on. Handwriting lines in books is supporting the children in our setting. Okay. Posture posters up in the classrooms as a reminder. Nice. All right, lovely. Thank you for that. Okay, I'm going to carry on. I'll keep mentioning these lovely examples as we're going as well, because they're really, really helpful. Thank you for those. So in terms of paper position, this is roughly what we would like to see. So we've got our left-handers slightly tilted to the right, right-handers slightly tilted to the left. Okay, and different ways to support. What I'm actually going to do, because I'm conscious of the time, I'm just going to go through these, but I want to really move on to the S factors, so specifically how we teach handwriting. So do feel free to ask me any questions at the end, but it's just basically strategies to support. We've got some information on pressure, how to support, and then coming back to the P-check, so thinking about using that as a kind of tool to assess readiness. And these are helpful tips, which you've got your slides, so you can have a look. Okay, so we're going to move on to kind of the final section, which is all about specifically how to teach handwriting. So really the crux of what we're doing. So I want to go over some letter shape. I want to talk about letter families as well, and then the general kind of rules that we would go by. So letter families. The one I'm showing you now may well be different to what you're using. There are lots of different variations on letter families. Can you give me a quick thumbs up if you are using letter families in the first place to teach handwriting? Couple, lovely. Okay. Nice, thank you. Brilliant, thank you. Can you give me a thumbs up now, please, if you are teaching handwriting solely through phonics? And it's fine if you are, it's just so I can kind of get an idea. Okay, great, thank you. So, brilliant. So I think hopefully we're all familiar with letter families then. So the basic premise of a letter family is that they're letters that start in the same place. So they've got that same movement pattern. And in a moment, I'll show you an example. I've used various different ones just because there's lots of different schemes out there that use slightly different formation families. The one that's in the writing framework is different to this one. So I need to say that, but do bear them in mind. Okay, so how do we actually teach handwriting? So we're assuming we've got our children ready for writing. They've got a good understanding of positional and directional language. They understand that marks have meaning. They can hold a pencil. They can sit. Now we're ready to teach the first part, which is always letter shape. So that letter formation. And that's why we always talk about formation families at the very beginning. If you've got students higher up school who are still struggling to use a consistent letter formation, I would definitely recommend going back to letter families, working out which ones they are struggling with, and then going back to practice them. Because if they're not writing them the same every time, they are not writing automatically. Okay, we touched on this very briefly earlier, and we talked a little bit about the Sassoon style. You may already know, but the Sassoon style was designed by, she was actually a graphic designer called Rosemary Sassoon, and she created this font specifically with the aim of teaching handwriting. There's a really interesting interview with Rosemary Sassoon on the TES pedagogy. I think it's available on YouTube. If you get 20 minutes, have a listen. It's quite interesting if you're thinking about handwriting. She created this font to be used as a modern way of teaching handwriting. And how she's done it was to include simple exit flicks on letters that end on the right for the most part. So you can see the A's got a simple exit flick, the B ends on the left, and so doesn't have an exit flick. The reason it's important to mention this is because throughout the curriculum, it talks about knowing which letters are best left unjoined. A really easy way to do this is to think about your letters which end on the left. You can see on the row here, we're not joining letters that end on the left. You might have a different way of doing that, that's fine. It's up to you, that needs to be detailed in your policy. Some schools might say that that's not what they want to do, which is fine. But certainly from kind of an easy point of view, it's a really easy thing to remember that if we end on the left, we're not going to join that letter. And I'm just going to remind you that by the end of Key Stage 2, we don't have to be joining absolutely every single letter. The curriculum repeatedly talks about which letters are best left unjoined. Okay. Oh, there's a link. I've put a link in. That's the link to the podcast if you're interested. She just talks about how she wanted to create it to keep it really simple because we know that's what works best. Really quick note, we know that we're not to teach using continuous cursive anymore, so using that lead-in stroke. It's specifically mentioned in the English Ofsted report, the Bold Beginnings report as well. This negates letter families. So if you're using a lead-in stroke, there are no letter families because all your letters are beginning on the line. So it's not something we're advocating, and we also know it's mentioned in the writing framework not to use that. Okay. So letters belong to formation families. What I'm going to do is I have to just apologise because the one on the right-hand side of your screen is now updated. Oh, nice. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to attempt to flip back my screen. I hope this works again. I'm on the wrong mouse, bear with me. So if I do that, hopefully you can see, and then do I spotlight here if I stop my slides? And then how do I do this? Is that a spotlight, Carl? Can you see my hand or is it still a small one?
No, I can still see still you and still see your slide. So if you stop sharing up at the top, that's it. So I've got you just on camera at the moment.
Okay, so then I need to.
Got a separate camera, haven't you?
Okay.
You want me to spotlight it? Oh, there you go. We've got both. That's really good. That's both of you now. That's you on the left and you on the camera on the right.
You can see me twice. Lovely. Okay, so the ones that I've got here, I'm just going to show you. So these are the letter families I've been using, and I have to apologise because these are now slightly out of date. So originally, these are the ones that were used in the writing framework. These were taken from Morell's handwriting. We don't have any affiliation. I'm just telling you where it's from. What's happened now is they've split them. So you've still got the one at the, there's an appendix at the back of the writing framework which uses this. You've got the COAGQD, that's one family. Then you've got ILTKJ, so all the letters that pull down. Then you've got VWUYF, so down up. Then you've got the push and pull, so pull down and push up, RNMHPB. And then you've got the kind of random ones, so ESXZ. So they might be similar to what you're doing, but I just want to show you kind of the logic behind them. Okay, so hopefully you can see that. So if I do the first family, and feel free to copy these as well. So what I'm going to show you is if I do a C, so I'm going anti-clockwise all the time with this letter family. I don't give them a name. You can use a mnemonic if you like. I know somebody mentioned that, which is absolutely fine. But just keep it simple. You could just say that these are the curly round letters. It doesn't really matter as long as what you're doing is consistent throughout and you'd want to have that detailed in your policy. So if I can do a C, I can do an O because I'm doing exactly the same movement. If I can do a C and an O, I can do an A. I can then do a G because it's starting off in exactly the same place. And exactly the same for the Q. And exactly the same for the D. And you can show that to your children if you like by saying, right, here's our magic C. So I do all my C's. And then each one of those can be one of the letters. So I've got my C, that can be an O. That C can be an A. So if you can do a C, you can do all of these. Into a Q and into a D. Okay. And then I'm going to do the next one. Some schools I know are teaching, some schools teach this family first in this order. Other schools are teaching this next family first. And my understanding is the reasoning behind it is because they feel that forming a pull down line is easier than forming an anti-clockwise circle. So it depends what you want to do. So the next family would be, I call them the pull down letters. So I pull down for my I pull down for my L. I pull down for my T. I pull down, obviously I'm pushing back up for my K if I'm doing it with a loop, and I'm pulling down for my J. Okay, so if a child can pull down, you could even do some patterning in your fluency time. Pull down, short, long, short, long. Hopefully you can see that okay. So it just gives you an idea. The next family would be the pull down, push back up. So in this case, my root letter is R. So I've had a C, an I, and an R. And it's because I'm going to pull down and push back up to create my N. So it's exactly the same. I'm going to pull down, push back up to create my M. Same for the H, pull down, push back up. Same for the P, pull down, push back up. Same for the B, pull down, push back up. Using letter families can really support the confusion we often see between B and D because they're in completely different families. A nice way to look at it is if you write the word bed, depending on the age of your pupil, you've got the B is in one family, and then obviously the D is in a different family. So they are different letters. Okay. And then finally, you've got the kind of random family at the end. You can call this what you like. We've got our E. These are kind of the roundy and zigzaggy ones, and Z. Okay, so they don't really have so much of a pattern. A bit like tricky words, you just have to learn them. Okay, so they're the letter families that I would suggest. Obviously, you might have a slightly different version in your school, but again, that would come back to making sure it's in your policy as to how you're doing it, which order you're teaching in, and at what point. So that's not something I can tell you. You need to make that decision as a school. So we know that we don't actually officially have to have a handwriting policy. It's not one of those statutory ones we have to have, but I would highly recommend that you have one, because you can then detail exactly how you're going to teach it. You know, it might be that you wait until, for example, after children have learned all the first letter sounds, and then you start saying, actually, now what we're going to do is we've learnt the letter sounds, and they might even have a vague idea about the formation, but we're going to officially start teaching the letter formation families, and then go through it in a sequential order. Does that make sense? Okay, lovely. Right, I will go back to my other screen. Hopefully this will work again. Bear with me. Okay, there.
So Michelle, while you're just doing that, so you would say, let's get the phonics going and get the children settled in, and then we'll start that structured handwriting. Not at the same time, essentially. There'd be a slight delay. So is that right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it really does. It's really hard to give a definitive answer because there's so many different phonics schemes. I know what's happening in lots of schools is that it's being taught through the phonics, which is not what we're wanting. It's not what we're advocating. What we are advocating is for schools to consider, you've got your phonics order. So say if by Christmas you're following, I don't know which one has done them all by Christmas, but whichever phonics scheme has taught all the phonemes, the individual phonemes by Christmas, then potentially, yeah, children understand the letter sounds, but then we now need to teach the letter families so that they can kind of bring it all together. Some schools might be better off doing it after October half term, depending on what your phonics scheme is. But I suppose the big thing is to have that consistency across staff so that everybody is saying the same thing, just like you do with phonics.
Yeah,
you know,
having that really clear
needs to be
progression. This is what we're doing. Okay, that's really good.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, carry on. So I'm just going to kind of go through the final sections of how to teach handwriting, because I do want to just bring us on to some case studies towards the end, and I'm really conscious of the time. So once we've taught the letter formation families, we will potentially also be teaching about space, size, and sitting on the line, maybe all at the same time. This is a huge topic, which I can't really get into in this session, but what this basically is relating to is what type of paper you are using, i.e. does it have lines, does it not? So that's where your sitting will come in. Again, this is going to go back to your policy. Do you want to have children writing on the line from the beginning, or do you not? There's no real kind of definitive answer again. I would suggest personally that sitting on the line, if children understand that, makes sense. It's better for legibility, and it enables them to kind of gauge the size of the letters as well. So I personally would recommend that. Okay, I'm just going to go through these. And we talked, sorry, just go back to there. Where we talk about stringing as our S factor, what we actually mean is joining. Okay. Again, this is going to be up to you as a setting to determine how and when you teach joining. You can think of it really simply. So if you're using, like Read Write Ink, for example, calls them washing line joins, I think. Again, I would advocate a very simple approach. So are you talking about a top join, a round join, a baseline join, or a straight across join? And again, adopt that consistent language. So when we're talking about, say if you're joining O and O together and you're making that sound oo, you don't want to start teaching joining until children are fully secure in their letter formations. So you do need to have a think about how and when that's done. But just as an example, if you were teaching the oo, you can describe that as a straight across top join, because you're just going straight across from one O to the next. Does that make sense? If you're doing, say, for example, I into L, that would be more of a baseline join because you're coming down and back up. Okay. Right, I'm just going to whiz through. Okay, really quickly, I won't go into much detail on these because I'm very aware of the time. I've borrowed these from another training session I did recently this year. And what I wanted to do was just highlight how you guys hopefully can come away feeling empowered to look at your settings and look for difficulties and how we can support with them. So I've just taken some examples. These are real examples. I've borrowed them, as I say, from another trust. So what we did was we had the writing. So just like you do in your writing moderation, it's really difficult because I think sometimes moderators are not necessarily looking at the handwriting in detail. I know they are also looking at the writing, but I'm talking about specifically letter forms. Is the writing sitting on the line? You know, those kind of basics of handwriting that we would be looking for. And you can see here where I've just circled some of the difficulties that I've seen. So we've got, this is a perfect example of all the letters are sitting on top of the line. This pupil is not, you can see here, where they've got, I mean, I think that's why so many miles. So they're just, everything's sitting on top. They haven't got that understanding of needing to bring the letters down. And you can see in the word floating as well, I didn't highlight that, but it's kind of actually floating off the line. So then it's, what do we do about this? How can we remedy this? How can we support? What I would do with this particular pupil is I would go back to thinking about what type of line guides they're using. So do they understand how far to go up, how far to go down? Checking as well that the lines are bold enough. You know, can this child see the line? Because quite often they're not actually on or off the line. You know, could be some really simple tweaks that can support that improved legibility for a pupil like this. Okay, I'm just going to keep going through just some more examples. Here, again, this is that paper that I've been using. I'd urge you to think about what type of paper you're using to record on. Sometimes handwriting paper can be quite complicated. A more kind of basic style where it's just a simple shade can be really useful, just again to promote that understanding of how far to go up and how far to go down. Okay, so you can think of it as kind of being a bit of a handwriting detective. So if you are assessing handwriting, just the handwriting, you'd want to consider the context. Ideally, you'd have eyes on, so you would have observed the process. That's the biggest thing. Because if you're not observing, an A can still look the same, depending on, you know, it might have been formed completely differently, but it'll still look like an A. Okay, think about the S factors. So first of all, think about that formation. Is the child fully secure with the shape of the letters? And then if applicable, are joins consistently used? Okay. So I'm just going to carry on because I want to get through the kind of end. And just to highlight as well, the national curriculum talks about joining talks about writing with a joined style as soon as they can form letters correctly with the correct orientation. Okay, and we do know that attempting to join before a child's ready can nearly always lead to difficulties in my experience. Okay. So, how would we know when to intervene? Really, really briefly. You'd want to think about, is an intervention necessary? Is it going to be smart for your pupil? You know, balancing how much time they've got with how much time they can practice. And what would it actually look like in your school? So what would the intervention or support be? And we always talk about how it's much easier to get it right from the start. Okay. And I want to end on this because this kind of ties everything together. So how do we actually plan for handwriting? Everything we know points to the fact that having a handwriting policy is essential. If we don't have one, we're not going to have a kind of consistent framework of how to do things. I would highly recommend thinking about the following things. So we've got, what are our aims, our rationale, and that will also enable you as practitioners to have those professional conversations with inspectors. You know, if you can kind of justify your rationale behind how you're teaching handwriting, hopefully that's sufficient. Obviously, you want to include the curriculum expectations. You might wish to include the P checks in terms of that readiness for writing. Think about the S factors, so always teaching letter shape first using the formation families. Think about resources. Think about provision for your pupils with additional needs or those who need the most support. Think about your statutory assessment and obviously your own teacher-informed assessment. Timetabling and also kind of parental or community involvement. A way that I've done that in the past is had workshops for parents or done handwriting formation families in assemblies, kind of bigging it up really to the wider school community. You could even think about sending formation families home to parents, just as an example with exactly how to form the letters. Okay, and that is, the NHA do provide a booklet about developing a handwriting policy that has loads more information in. Okay, and that just brings me to the end of the slide. So I'm just going to stop sharing. I'm aware there was a lot of information to take in. Do we have, before we go, do we have any questions or comments or anything anyone wanted to mention?
Michelle, someone had to leave like 5 minutes ago, and they had a question about handwriting lines. So more and more schools are using handwriting lines, not just in a handwriting book, they're using it in a whole host of books. And they were keen to ask for me to ask you, what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, well, I think it depends on the reason for doing so. I think you could use, again, it would come back to what you've decided as a staff. Personally, just this is me as a teacher, I would maybe think about having specific line guides for those subjects where you might be writing more. I can't see how it's necessary for other subjects personally. And there has to be a point where children are able to transfer their knowledge of letter height to a standard line. So whether that's a 6mm, 8mm, 10mm line, it doesn't really matter. There has to be a point where they develop that understanding, because they won't have handwriting line guides when they get to year 7.
Yeah. So that sort of transition to independence is sort of need to think about that, isn't it? And
yeah.
do you think that if children were to come through school as better handwriters, then they might not necessarily need them all the way through? However, in the early stages, if say like year 5 and 6 don't have great handwriting, then they might need it, but it doesn't mean that we always need it in 5 and 6.
Absolutely. And I would also advocate, not your whole class is exactly the same. So it's really, I know in a school, you get your 30 books, this is what we're using, but actually if you look at the children's natural size of writing, even a pupil I was working with today, he's year 7, and I said, have you ever thought about recording on every other line? Because his natural size of writing was quite large. So on I think this is a standard 8mm line I was using with him, it was becoming quite messy because you couldn't really see clearly. But actually, if he just recorded on every other line, his writing in isolation, it's just a bit more spread out. So yeah, absolutely. I certainly don't think you need them all the way through Key Stage 2 even. It depends on the child and the subject, I would say.
Yeah, thank you. Everybody else, I know it's getting late, but please do pop any questions into the chat, or if you're brave, you can come off mute. And I know Michelle will support you with that.
Yeah, so I've sent the slides, so hopefully you should get them. And if you do have any specific queries, please do just get in touch.
Yeah, we'll do a follow-up email, and remember the recording link will be in one of our think pieces. Michelle, I know people will start to put thank yous and things in the chat. It's getting late. I can see why there is a 3-day training on handwriting. Like the complexity, the detail that you've put into that was absolutely fabulous, and you can see there's so much to offer. And that comes back to your expertise and the great work that the NHA do as well. So I'm so pleased that you were able to do this for us and share some of that expertise. So a massive, massive thank you. And I loved it all. I've jotted numerous notes down of new learning for me. And my highlight for me is that leading joins. That I often get asked, do we or don't we? But having the knowledge about where that came from and why we might not be wanting to do that is super powerful for me. So a massive thank you and a big well done. So that's great.
Not at all. Well, thank you so much for all the contributions. And yeah, like I say, please do get in touch. We do lots of different training, but I monitor the training inbox, so the emails can come to me if needed. But obviously, Carl and Elaine have got my details as well. So yeah, thank you very much. you.